This is Criminal Interrupted. In February 2000, the quiet town of Aberdeen, New South Wales, became the centre of one of Australia's most shocking criminal cases. Katherine Knight, a former abattoir worker with a long history of violence in her relationships, murdered her partner, 44-year-old John Price, stabbing him at least 37 times during a final escalation of domestic violence. What followed stunned even seasoned investigators. Knight mutilated Price after his death, actions that would ultimately make her the first woman in Australian history to receive a life sentence with no possibility of parole. This episode contains descriptions of domestic violence, psychological abuse, and graphic criminal acts. Please take care of yourself and feel free to step away at any time. If you enjoyed these episodes, I encourage you to follow or subscribe to Criminal Interrupted on your favourite podcast app. As I've mentioned before, I'm currently focusing on this podcast full-time due to a heart condition, so every follow and review makes a huge difference. Thank you for listening and for your incredible support. Katherine Knight was born on October 24, 1955, one of a pair of non-identical twin girls. Even as a child, people described her as the more traditionally feminine of the two, the one who liked helping her mum around the house, cooking, cleaning, and playing with dolls. But Katherine's childhood was complicated long before she ever understood it. Her mother, Barbara, had originally been married to a man named John Jack Rohan. They lived in Aberdeen, a small town in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, and had 4 sons together. While still married to Jack, Barbara began an affair with one of his co-workers, Kenneth "Ken" Knight. The scandal in such a small community was so intense that Barbara and Ken were essentially run out of town. They moved to Moore, leaving her 4 sons behind. The 2 eldest stayed with their father, and the 2 younger were sent to live with an aunt in Sydney. Barbara and Ken went on to have 4 more children together, including the twin girls born in 1955, and Katherine was one of them. When Katherine was 4, Jack Rohan died, and his 2 eldest sons moved back in with Barbara and Ken. The household was now large, chaotic, and deeply dysfunctional. Ken Knight was a violent alcoholic. He regularly assaulted Barbara, and the abuse was so extreme that Barbara would later tell her daughters about it in graphic detail, often describing her hatred of sex and men in general. Katherine would later allege that she was sexually assaulted throughout her childhood by several family members, though not by her father. Psychiatrists accepted her claims, and other relatives have supported parts of her account. Barbara herself had a volatile personality. She was known for her explosive temper, her constant swearing, and a strict, no-nonsense approach to parenting. The kids did as they were told. No questions, no mucking around. With 6 children under one roof, the atmosphere was tense at the best of times. Despite the turmoil at home, Katherine had a soft spot for animals. She wasn't allowed to have pets, but if she found an injured bird or another small creature, she'd bring it home and nurse it back to health. That gentle side existed right alongside something much darker. In 1969, the family moved back to Aberdeen. It was a tiny country town of about 1,500 people, where the local abattoir was the main source of employment. Katherine was devastated that same year when her uncle Oscar, the one person she felt truly close to, died by suicide. She would later claim that his ghost continued to visit her. At school, Katherine's behaviour swung between extremes. When she wasn't in a rage, she could be polite, well-behaved, even award-winning. But when she snapped hard. She was known as a bully, especially towards smaller students. She got into fistfights with boys and held her own. She once attacked a student with a weapon, and on another occasion, a teacher injured her while acting in self-defense. By the time she left school at 15, Katherine still couldn't read or write. She took a job at a clothing factory as a cutter, but it didn't last long. There was only one job she truly wanted, the same job her father had done since he was 14, working at the abattoir. Her first application was rejected, but she tried again in 1971 and got in. She was just 16 years old at the time. Katherine started out doing the grim, messy work, mopping blood, cleaning carcasses, dealing with the parts no one else wanted to touch. But she worked her way up quickly. She became a slicer, then moved into boning, and she was good at it. Very good. She was precise, efficient, and took enormous pride in her knives. She kept them razor sharp and in perfect condition, hanging them over her bed so they were, quote, always handy if she needed them, end quote. She kept that habit for years. On the surface, people described Katherine as kind-natured, helpful, even sweet. She was tall, slim, had red hair, wore glasses, handmade clothes, and enjoyed knitting and bingo. Nothing remarkable at first glance. But underneath, there was a side of her that people learned not to provoke. The temper, the language, the violence, the vindictiveness. If someone crossed Katherine, she didn't just get even. She made sure she came back 10 times harder. And in a small town like Aberdeen, people remembered that. Katherine met her first husband, David Kellett, in 1973 while they were both working at the Aberdeen abattoir. Their relationship moved fast, the kind of whirlwind romance that feels exciting in the moment but doesn't have much foundation underneath it. They didn't bother with a big wedding. Instead, they jumped on a motorbike, rode to the registry office in Muswellbrook, signed the papers, and celebrated with friends at a local pub. Katherine was 18 years old. But David got a glimpse of her darker side almost immediately. On their wedding night, David had been drinking heavily all day and struggled to perform sexually the way Katherine expected. She woke him up by putting her hands around his throat and strangling him. It was her way of letting him know she wasn't happy. Despite that terrifying start, the marriage actually settled into a reasonably calm period at first. Katherine's softer side, the helpful, affectionate version of her, seemed to take the lead, but it didn't last. Within a year, her temper and mood swings began to escalate, and the violence followed. By the time Katherine gave birth to their first daughter, Melissa, in 1976, David had reached his limit. He fled to Queensland with another woman, who was also pregnant with his child. Katherine was devastated, furious, and spiralling. In a rage, she walked down to the local railway tracks and placed baby Melissa directly on the line. A man walking past saw the infant just in time. He ran down, grabbed her, and carried her away. A train passed through shortly after. Later that same day, Katherine picked up an axe and began swinging it around, threatening people in the street. The police were called, and she was taken to a local hospital for a mental health assessment. She was released soon after. Only a few days later, on August 3, 1976, Katherine went to the home of a co-worker, Molly Perry. She told Molly that baby Melissa was sick and she needed a lift to the doctor. Molly, her mother, and her young brother all got into the car to help. But Melissa wasn't sick. Once they were on the road, Katherine pulled out a butcher's knife and slashed Molly across the cheek. She demanded to be driven to Coffs Harbour, a 6-hour trip, where David's mother, Jean, lived. Katherine later admitted her plan was to confront Jean about why David had left her, kill her, and then take her own life. Instead, Molly managed to pull into a service station to get help. Katherine got out of the car, dragging Molly's younger brother with her and holding the knife to him. Police arrived quickly and disarmed her by using broomsticks. One officer received a minor cut during the struggle. Katherine was taken back to hospital for another psychiatric assessment. While she was being treated, Melissa stayed with Katherine's parents, Barbara and Ken. Doctors diagnosed Katherine with a personality disorder. David, still in Queensland, got a call from police about what had happened. He returned home and visited Katherine in hospital with his mother, Jean. A hearing was held on August 9, 1976, just 6 days after the incident, and it was decided that Katherine could be released into the care of David and Jean. They were instructed to ensure she took her medication, but the violence resumed almost immediately. On the way to pick up Melissa from Katherine's parents' house, Barbara stormed out and attacked David, grabbing him by the throat and blaming him for Katherine's breakdown. Katherine got out of the car, walked straight up to her mother, and punched her in the face, knocking her to the ground. She stood over Barbara and screamed, quote, "Don't ever touch David again," end quote. After that, David and Katherine reconciled. They moved to Queensland, and Katherine found work as a meat slicer at another abattoir. She loved her knives so much that she asked David to mount them on the bedroom wall, quote, "just in case she needed them," end quote. But the same patterns followed them north. Katherine's temper didn't go anywhere. She was controlling, demanding, and still furious about David's affair. Their arguments were constant and often physical, and Katherine was always the aggressor. She hit him with her fists, with pots, with frying pans, with whatever she could grab. She also had an affair with a co-worker, which she openly admitted was payback. David even walked in on them in bed together. Still, he tried to make the marriage work. They had a second daughter, Natasha, but Katherine's behaviour only escalated. She would tell David to go to the pub for a few beers, then call the pub and demand he come home immediately. One night, when he arrived later than she wanted, she hit him over the head with a frying pan the moment he walked through the door. He ended up in hospital, but he didn't press charges. During another argument, she held a knife to his throat. On a different night, she poured petrol over his clothes and set them on fire. Even Barbara, Katherine's own mother, warned David, quote, "Don't play up on her, she'll kill you," end quote. In 1983, David hit David over the head again, splitting his skull open and sending him back to hospital. That was the breaking point. He didn't press charges, but he ended the marriage for good. Katherine responded by stripping their house bare. She took everything, right down to the curtains and the light bulbs. David didn't care. He was actually relieved. He felt lucky to be alive. Katherine moved back to her parents' farm in Aberdeen with Melissa and Natasha. She returned to her old job at the Aberdeen abattoir, back to the knives she loved so much. But in 1985, her employment at the abattoir was terminated. It didn't take long for Katherine to fall into another relationship. This time it was with David Saunders, a man she met at the Aberdeen Bowling Club. And just like her relationship with David Kellett, things started off beautifully. For a while, they were both genuinely happy. But that darker side of Katherine, the one that never stayed buried for long, was always there, waiting. One day, without warning, Katherine snapped. She accused Saunders of cheating on her, and her unpredictable, violent behaviour surfaced for the first time in their relationship. From that point on, the next 3 years was a cycle. One day she was loving and affectionate, the next she was volatile and frightening. During one of their arguments, Katherine grabbed a knife, walked into the backyard, and killed Saunders' dog by slitting its throat. She later claimed she did it because Saunders had kicked her in the stomach when she told him she was pregnant. Saunders denied this completely. He insisted he never laid a hand on her, that she simply threw into one of her rages, started accusing him of things, and then killed his dog. Not long after, Katherine took an overdose of pills and had to be rushed to hospital. Katherine always maintained that Saunders was the violent one, and that anything she did was either self-defense or revenge. Saunders denied that too. And despite the chaos, they had a daughter together in 1988. In 1989, Katherine received a $15,000 compensation payout for a back injury. She used the money to pay off the house she and Saunders were living in, which effectively made it her house, not theirs. Not long after that, the relationship completely deteriorated. The arguments became more serious, and Katherine was even issued a restraining order against Saunders, though he insisted it should have been the other way around, and he wasn't wrong. During yet another violent argument, Katherine stabbed him in the stomach with a pair of scissors. The injury wasn't serious and didn't require medical treatment, but it was enough for Saunders to finally walk away. But, like so many abusive cycles, it didn't stay over. They got back together soon after, trying once again to make it work. It didn't last. After several more violent incidents, including Katherine cutting up all of Saunders' clothes and throwing them out, the relationship ended for good. Meanwhile, Katherine continued to punish her first husband, David Keller, in her own way. Anything he sent for their daughters, Christmas presents, birthday cards, flowers, she threw them out before the girls ever saw them. Then she'd tell the girls their father had never sent them anything at all. After things ended with David Saunders, Katherine didn't stay single for long. She never did. She was someone who had to have a partner, and it never took her much time to find the next one. This time, it was with a man named John Chillingworth. Just like her past relationships, the beginning was wonderful. Chillingworth later said Katherine was terrific to be with, warm, fun, affectionate. He genuinely believed he'd found his soulmate. They had actually met decades earlier, back when Katherine was just 16 and starting out at the Aberdeen abattoir. Nothing happened between them then. Chillingworth eventually moved away, got married and lived his own life. But when he returned to the area years later, he and Katherine crossed paths again and the connection sparked immediately. Because he'd been gone for so long, Chillingworth wasn't aware of the now infamous Katherine Knight stories that everyone in town seemed to have. His mates filled him in pretty quickly though, but he brushed it off. He was convinced she was the one. Not long into the relationship, Katherine fell pregnant, her fourth child overall. And just like before, once the pregnancy was confirmed, her true colours began to show. The argument started, the volatility, the sudden mood swings. After one fight, she went and spent the night with her ex, David Saunders, and made sure Chillingworth knew about it. There were also problems between Katherine's eldest daughter, Melissa, and Chillingworth. Melissa didn't like him, and he didn't think much of her either. Chillingworth later admitted that he hit Melissa once, something he said he regretted immediately. And Katherine made sure he paid for it. She smashed his false teeth, and when he confronted her about it, she smashed his second pair too. Just like her previous relationships, things swung wildly between calm and chaos. One minute everything was fine, the next it was violent and unpredictable. Katherine then gave birth to their son in 1991. Not long after the baby was born, Katherine and Chillingworth got into a physical fight. Chillingworth was charged with assault, and Katherine took out a restraining order against him. They separated, but as usual it didn't last. They got back together, even though Katherine never withdrew the assault charge. They eventually went to court together, and Chillingworth walked out with a good behaviour bond and a fine, and then the two of them went home together. Chillingworth was a heavy drinker, and that didn't help the situation, but to his credit, he eventually quit. He even started helping the Salvation Army with drug and alcohol counselling. Through that work, he was offered a short-term job in Queensland in 1993. Just 2 weeks. He took it, but he liked Queensland so much that he ended up staying. His plan was to have Katherine and the kids move up once he was settled. When Katherine visited him, they had another explosive fight, the kind that ended things for good. What Chillingworth didn't know at the time was that Katherine had already moved on. She was seeing someone else, John Price. By this point, Katherine had been unemployed for 8 years. She was living off her compensation payout and a fortnightly government pension. She had 4 children to 3 different fathers. Her eldest was 17, her youngest just 2. John Price, born on April 4, 1955, was the eldest of 6 kids. He left school at 14, barely able to read or write, but he was a hard worker. He spent his life operating heavy machinery, working in earth moving, trucking, and mining. He married a woman named Colleen, and together they had 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. Then tragedy hit the Price family. John's father and brother got into a heated domestic argument. His father picked up a gun and began loading it. His brother grabbed another gun and tried to fire a warning shot, but the bullet struck their mother instead, and she died instantly. The death was ruled accidental, and John's brother was charged with manslaughter. Losing his mother devastated John. He needed a fresh start, so he looked for work elsewhere. In 1981, he moved his family to Aberdeen. John was known as an easygoing, likeable bloke, the kind of person who got along with everyone. He was laid back, generous, and would help anyone without expecting anything in return. He worked hard and loved nothing more than a beer with his mates after a long day. In 1988, after 15 years of marriage, he and Colleen separated. But it wasn't bitter. In fact, it showed what kind of a man John was. When Colleen asked to borrow money to fix her fridge, he didn't lend her the cash, he bought her a brand new fridge. Another time, when he heard she was going on holiday, he quietly slipped $500 into her bank account without telling her. John was a regular at the Aberdeen Hotel, known locally as the Top Pub because it sat on the hill. The other pub in town was naturally the Bottom Pub. And it was at this Top Pub that John Price met Katherine Knight. Katherine fell hard and fast. She was determined to make this relationship work. She was tired of failed relationships. She wanted this one to last. They struck up a conversation, and that was it. They became a couple almost immediately. And like always, the beginning was wonderful. The first few months was fantastic. They were happy and they were in love. But after about a year, the cracks began to show. Katherine became paranoid, convinced John was cheating on her. Ever since David Kellett had cheated on her in the first marriage, she seemed to believe every partner would eventually betray her. Despite the tension, she eventually moved into John's house. But John refused to marry her. This became a major sticking point. John told her he loved her, but he wanted his children to inherit his house. He didn't want Katherine to be entitled to any of it. That was the main reason he wouldn't marry her. And slowly, the arguments escalated from verbal to physical. The relationship deteriorated once again. It didn't help that John occasionally slipped up and called her by his ex-wife's name, Colleen. Katherine began making worrying threats. She told John more than once that she would kill him. Everyone, including John, brushed it off as empty talk. During one argument, she told him, quote, "You'll never get me out of this house. I'll do you in first," end quote. As time went on, Katherine sensed the relationship slipping away, and it made her furious. In 1998, she secretly filmed items in John's house, things she claimed he'd stolen from the mine where he worked. We're talking about ridiculous items, a can of bug spray, an expired first aid kit, old junk that was going to be thrown out anyway. Katherine claimed she made the video because John hit her, and she wanted leverage. That if he touched her again, she'd send the footage to his boss. But the truth was much simpler than that. John had told her he wanted her out of the house, and Katherine wanted revenge. She sent the video to John's bosses. After they watched it, she invited them into John's home and personally pointed out every item. The expired first aid kit was the final straw. Even though it was out of date and destined for the bin, the mine fired John. 17 years of service, gone in an instant. He worked his way up to earning $100,000 a year, and now it was all gone. John kicked Katherine out immediately, but unbelievably it didn't last. John grew lonely. He blamed himself. His mates were stunned when, after a few months, he and Katherine got back together. This time, though, she didn't move back into his house. Still, the decision cost John friendships. It also caused major tension with his son, Jonathan, who already hated Katherine, and now despised her even more for getting his father sacked. When they discussed reconciling, Katherine told John, quote, "If you take me back, this time it's to the death," end quote. The arguments resumed quickly, and they grew more violent. Most of the fights were about John losing his job, though he eventually found new work. Katherine also began causing trouble with John's youngest daughter. She lived with her mother, Colleen, but visited John and Katherine regularly. John's older children had already moved out and started their own families. Katherine's two eldest daughters, Melissa and Natasha, had also moved out. but her two youngest still lived with her. Katherine started telling John's youngest daughter cruel things, like that John wasn't really her father. When John confronted her on this, Katherine was doing the dishes. She turned and lunged at him with a knife, stabbing him in the upper left chest. John didn't seek treatment. He slapped a band-aid on it and never reported it. The wound left a permanent scar. Towards the end of 1999, Katherine asked her nephew to steal John's uninsured $20,000 car and burn it. She offered him $500. When that wasn't enough, she asked him to throw battery acid in John's face. He refused both times. Katherine later told her older brother, quote, "I'm going to kill Pricey, and I'm going to get away with it. I'll get away with it because I'll make out I'm mad," end quote. Meanwhile, John desperately wanted to end the relationship again, but he couldn't see a safe way out. He was terrified she'd target his children. On the afternoon of February 27th, 2000, another violent fight broke out. John thought Katherine went for a knife. Having already been stabbed once, he bolted to a neighbour's house and called police. He had scratches all over him, and Katherine had bruises too. John told police he wanted her out. She had her own place in town, but they told him they couldn't do anything. He'd need a court order. By now, the relationship had dragged on for 6 years on and off. There had been highs, but the lows were getting darker. That night, as they'd done so many times before, they made up, and John went to bed. At 2:30 a.m. on Monday, February 28th, John woke up suddenly. He could see Katherine's silhouette standing over him. Her arms were behind her back. He jumped out of bed, terrified she had a knife. She didn't, that time. John went to work that day and told his mate what had happened. They'd never seen him so distressed. He said he genuinely thought he was a dead man when he woke up to see her standing over him like that. His boss offered him a place to stay, but John refused. That night, he went home and had a calm conversation with Katherine. They agreed things couldn't continue the way they were, but Katherine refused to leave. That night, police arrived with a restraining order, not against her, but against John, taken out because of the fight the night before. On February 29, 2000, it began like any other day. Katherine woke early, made John breakfast, packed his lunch, and sent him off for work. But beneath that routine was a storm building on both sides. At work, John asked his boss for permission to go to the courthouse. He wanted to apply for its own restraining order against Katherine. Meanwhile, Katherine visited her solicitor, then dropped in on her friends, showing them the bruises from the fight 2 nights earlier. She told one friend she wasn't going to let John get away with it. She had her injuries documented by a doctor. Around lunchtime, John met with the chamber magistrate in Muswellbrook. He explained the history of violence, the escalating threats, and his fear of what Katherine might do. A restraining order was issued against her. That night, John went to the top pub. Katherine took her children out for dinner, then asked her daughter Natasha if her 2 youngest could stay the night. Natasha agreed. John got home around 9:30 p.m. Katherine arrived at 11. She still had a key and let herself in. There was no argument, no confrontation. Instead, they had sex. Whatever protection the restraining orders were supposed to offer, they were ignored that night. The next morning, John didn't show up for work, something he had never done. He was reliable to a fault. His co-workers tried calling him repeatedly, but there was no answer. They even checked with police to see if there had been an accident. There hadn't. A neighbour noticed John's car was still in the driveway, which was unusual because John always left before him. Concern grew quickly, and his colleagues called police. 2 officers arrived just after 8 a.m. When they knocked, no one answered. They noticed blood on the front door handle. The house was dark inside. They saw something was hanging in the entryway, and at first glance, it looked like a curtain or a blanket. The officers couldn't wake anyone, so they moved around to the back of the house, even saw some meat lying on the ground, and then eventually forced entry through the back door. The moment they stepped inside, they realized something was terribly wrong. What they had thought was a curtain wasn't fabric at all. It was something far more disturbing, something that made one officer recoil in shock. One of the officers recounted, quote, "There was something hanging, blocking my entry into the hallway of the house. I thought it looked like some type of blanket or some sort of covering that had been placed up on the archway. So I remember I used my left hand to push it aside, and immediately I could feel coldness coming on my left arm. So I looked down, and my left arm was just covered in blood. Initially, I thought I'd injure myself breaking through the back door. I couldn't understand why my arm was bleeding. I realized then it was a human pelt. It was a skin, modest the head, the full skin just hanging from the top door frame. I looked past it, saw a torso on the ground without a head, without any genitalia. I could look through from there into the lounge room, and I saw what appeared to be a human being, or what was left. And so it was at that point that I realized what had happened. For something that I'd never seen before, I'd never experienced, I had an immediate idea of what had gone on. There was blood everywhere, a line of blood out from the door into the kitchen area. There's a pot on the stove. On the table, there were a couple of plates that had meals prepared, vegetables and meat cooked sitting there." End quote. The officers immediately drew their weapons and began clearing the house, unsure if the offender was still inside. Down the hallway, they heard the sound of someone breathing, slow, heavy, almost like snoring. They followed the sound to a bedroom, where they found Katherine lying on the bed. She was groggy, barely conscious, and unresponsive. Empty blister packs nearby suggested she had overdosed. They carried her outside and secured her. She wasn't injured, but she was clearly under the influence of something. An ambulance took her to hospital, where she was admitted to the psychiatric ward. Police feared for Katherine's youngest children, but after a frantic search, they were found safe at Natasha's house. Crime scene investigators arrived soon after. As they moved through the home, the scale of what had happened became clear. The scene showed a prolonged, desperate struggle. Blood trails marked John's attempt to escape. He had made it as far as the front door before collapsing. The violence he endured was extreme. The officer continued, quote, "As you go out towards the lounge room, these bloodstains are getting heavier and heavier. There's big swipes where his blood soaked himself and sliding against the wall. And there's blood splatter on the screen, so he's nearly made it out. You just see the enormity of where it starts in the bedroom and progressively gets worse and worse. The blood pool was the width of the hallway, which was 1.2 meters wide. When we examined the body, you could see the body had been there in its entirety. There's a big stain on the floor where the head would have been. It's been skinned first. You can see she placed the skin on the carpet to sit there, and it's quite a substantial staining. There's also an outline of the head. So she's taken the head off there. You can see that she's walked in carrying it into the kitchen. There's this drip, drip, drip of blood all the way leading to the cooktop. But until we actually lifted the lid off, it wasn't confirmed. To me, it was a statement. She had cut the gluteus maximus off his backside. It's a big muscle, and she's cut that into 5 different steaks and she's cooked them, baked them in the oven. 2 of them were on one plate, 2 on another plate, and the 5th was out for the dog, I believe. It wasn't touched. But the meals, they were like a trophy, and they had the names of each person who was supposed to get them. There were 2 prepared meals on the table, complete with meat and vegetables. A piece of paper was placed next to each meal. A name was scribbled on each piece of paper. One was for John's son, the other for his youngest daughter." End quote. News spread quickly through Aberdeen. Many locals weren't surprised. Some even said they'd always feared Katherine was capable of something like this. As detectives pieced together the timeline after John's death, they discovered that in the hours following the murder, Katherine had cleaned herself up, driven into town, and withdrawn $1,000 from John's bank account. No one knows what she did with that money. On March 7, 2000, while still in the psychiatric ward, Katherine Knight was formally charged with John Price's murder during a special bedside court sitting. When police interviewed her, she had denied knowing anything about what had happened to John, yet in the same breath, she admitted she was responsible for his death. She claimed she had no memory of the night at all, insisting she was suffering from amnesia. It didn't take long for investigators to realise what she was doing. Katherine was preparing to argue that she had acted after years of being a victim of severe domestic violence, a battered wife defence. But as police dug deeper, the truth was impossible to ignore. Yes, Katherine had been in violent relationships, but she had been the source of that violence, not the victim. Every partner, every witness, every documented incident pointed in the same direction. Katherine was also assessed by multiple psychiatrists. They agreed she had a personality disorder, but they found no evidence of psychosis, no break from reality, no condition that would explain or excuse what she had done. Her claims of memory loss were also dismissed. Investigators concluded she was putting on a performance. The planning, the timing, the steps she took before and after the murder, all of it pointed to premeditation. She knew exactly what she was doing. Katherine initially pleaded not guilty. Her trial began on October 15, 2001, overseen by Justice Barry O'Keefe. He later said that in all his years as a barrister and judge, he had never encountered a case as disturbing as Katherine Knight's. She sat quietly in the dock, small, unremarkable, giving nothing away. Then, before the trial could properly begin, Katherine abruptly changed her plea to guilty. The sudden shift raised concerns. The judge worried she might later claim she was insane when she entered the plea. To be certain, he ordered another psychiatric evaluation. The result was the same as before. Katherine was sane, fully aware of her actions, and not suffering from any mental illness. A sentencing hearing followed. The court heard the full extent of the evidence. Katherine never reacted. She didn't look at the witnesses. She didn't look at the photographs. She stared straight ahead, expressionless. At one point, when confronting details were being presented, she suddenly began rocketing violently, screaming, then threw herself onto the floor. But the court saw it for what it was, an attempt to manipulate the proceedings. When the hearing resumed, she returned to a blank, emotionless state. In sentencing, the judge rejected every part of Katherine's defense. He found that her suicide attempt was not genuine, that her claims of amnesia were false, and that she had acted with clear planning and intent. She had openly threatened to kill John many times. She had even said she would get away with it by convincing people she was mentally unwell. The judge described her as vengeful, violent, and an extreme danger to society. He dismissed her battered wife claims entirely, noting that the evidence overwhelmingly showed she was the aggressor in their relationships. Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, a sentence the judge did not take lightly. He said sentencing anyone to life was significant, but sentencing a woman to life was even more so. But this case, he said, was as bad as they come. She had shown no remorse, no insight, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Releasing her would pose a real risk to future violence. Detective Robert Wells, who led the investigation, later said during interviews, he could tell she was only giving the information she wanted to give, nothing more. He believed then, and still believes now, that Katherine knows exactly why she did what she did, and simply refuses to say. After some time in prison, Katherine claimed she had found peace and was enjoying her life inside, but she clearly didn't enjoy the idea of spending the rest of her life there. She appealed her sentence to the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal, arguing it was too harsh, but the court rejected her appeal. To this day, Katherine Knight has never explained why she killed John Price. She has never expressed remorse, and she will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Thank you for listening.